It's exit 185 in Loganton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, Logan is great.
Oh, we've never gotten a
Yeah, I'm back in Sarasota, right?
Oh, we felt bad.
I asked a lot of friends up here to make sure it was nice and warm, but they got here, and they did.
Yeah, it's perfect timing getting into it towards the end of May. And how's Phil been doing? How's Phil been doing?
He seems to be busy.
We were
He
there,
spent
my,
much of the winter in Naples, Florida.
Has he got a place down there?
Yeah, but currently he's able to do remote working.
Yeah, that's what I've been doing as well. Yeah, we moved to Chicago and he close to kids, and so but I'm still practicing in Cleveland.
at my feet
I
was
think he moved to Florida because it's that too warm.
Yeah,
It's not overcast the way it is here.
and he's in one of the developments in Naples. He's in one of the gated developments, developed developments.
It's not gated,
yes,
but it's a development, you know, it's an assembly of different residences, all about the same configuration, some upstairs, some downstairs.
And we've got some friends that are in Lately, which is one of the big developments down there, but that's a little bit south, it's east, south, north. In Naples, or,
Well, you know, we have relatives in its executives. We have north of Bonita Springs. Enormous development. Evidently, individual developments on the side of larger
I'm looking at your
How would you describe the place that,
This is the one I made.
larger description of the place that developed?
But it's very pretty.
Great variety.
Two months down in Bonita Springs, I think it's Bonita Springs Country Club, golf club.
Welcome, Edith. How are you? You're good?
Yeah, but the weird part was,
You guys know Arlene Phil Fine, right? Arlene and Phil Fine. She's great for the Jewish news. Yeah, they had so much Cleveland, Chicago. So we run into a few of them. Karen and Alan Rosenberg. Yeah, they look good.
Well, we had a woman who used to try neighbor.
I wonder if she's still alive.
I wonder if everybody's still alive. All of my friends. We got back on Tuesday evening.
Hi. This past Tuesday.
4 days ago or something like that. What they did, yeah, 4 days ago.
Oh, definitely.
Did we take your seats? Is this where you always sit?
You want to sit here? No. Just remember Howard Plucker celebrated his 100th birthday.
That was in the paper.
Yeah.
That was in the paper.
So we should all be celebrating, right?
So we're getting
that's what I do, kind of practice and stuff here, remotely.
I used to have a colleague, so I had based the same area of Israel that I was in Evanston. I go to visit, to the watch up there, and he would talk, and he would go up to his house, and she had to go to bird.
It's not quite a hotel, right? Yeah, we're the Skokie, so we're one suburb over from Evanston.
Yes, where the Jews
Yeah, it's kind of like the Cleveland Plains. The Jewish communities moved down further, Highland Park, North, and other areas, but they're still strong in the East Coast. Yeah, how's it doing? And where's she at? Oh, she moved in there. Okay, great. I guess Eddie and Michelle Weinstein, I think one of their kids getting married this weekend. I think it's this weekend. If I'm not mistaken, because I know the Bryans were coming in. Friends with Eddie and Michelle. Yeah, it's surprising the number of Toyotas that moved to Chicago. Mostly for kids, I think. As often as we can. My middle daughter's engaged, so she checks out all the venues downtown Chicago. So we've seen almost no hotel, all these other places. Last 3 or 4 weekends that we've been in town has been all downtown. Well, it's very, they've got a river walk, which is very nice all there. So you walk right on the river, take your boat tour, using the tourist sites. And the sun works downtown, so I can go down and eat some lunch. It's a nice downtown. They have theater. A lot of great restaurants downtown. Yeah, and they've got a lot of goodies in town right now. They got a big show. Chicago is really on a much greater scale. Yeah. Sure.
Right here?
Chicago anyway, certainly the suburbs.
You're all set.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a daughter in Manhattan, so we get it on both sides. Oh yeah. Yeah, we have we have 2 in Chicago and 1 in New York. My wife and I both said here now, we'll go consider it.
But to me, this is crazy rules. If you go to overtime,
So what did you come
so you get the guy to stand on second.
That work for the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, every year.
And you moved directly to Shaker? Okay, and where'd you move to Shaker? Okay. So I grew up on Clayton. You may have known my dad, Norm Rosenberg, with his society. He would have been older. Okay. Great. Are you in one of the apartments there? Is it Chelsea? It's a hybrid, yeah, like our building. Construction going on across the street from you. Yeah, yeah. We were about to wait you at Auto Garden. Yeah. It'll really revitalize that area. Yeah, I've been there last year, so yeah, we've seen the being transformed. Now, granted, without Sam's Deli there, I mean, they really lost a lot, but what are you gonna do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting coming back, really, this is we really had a good time. It was really good. It was the older kids don't have their own kids yet. But my wife figured we were moving. That could be long. So might as well be there today.
Yes, I don't think Marty was one. I certainly be young. I'm not sure about Marty's doing what I think she's doing. Available. Did you belong here?
Me too.
I have to.
You'll be the only one to feel that way.
And the Lord said to Ellen, and the Lord said to Roger, making sure.
How you doing, Todd Rosenberg? Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, we moved to Chicago, and I've been on the weekend. Yeah. So we just go complex there. We joined the Reform Temple in Hartzmark. You know Evan Bachman? He's a wonderful.
I know the name.
Oh, yes, yeah, for this weekend, just for the weekend. Oh, thanks, I'm happy to show this here.
Even I see you regularly in Herb, I will see you walking that backwards and kind of have both.
Well, it's published authors that go up. Yeah, it'll be a paperback next week. It's on Kindle right now. Yeah, but trying to get you a copy of that.
That'd be great, but I'm not coming to you. Let me go by. We help each other. Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. And welcome to those who are live streaming. Glad to have you as well. So it looks like we have a little extra this morning. I don't know exactly why, but Erev Shavuot, something like that. But whatever the reason, more pastry needs no explanation. Couple of quick sort of preliminaries. First of all, thank you, Doris, to you for what I heard was a wonderful, wonderful session last week. Yeah. I have your materials. I haven't read them yet, but I'm looking forward to that. That Jordan had, I think.
Actually, you may not have read the message I sent you.
I may.
There was an error.
Oh, you did say that.
So there are new ones.
There are new ones there. Excellent. Very good. Did the error completely undermine everything you said? No.
You have to find it.
You have to find it. Very good. But I say this pretty much every time this happens, but it's such a thrill for me when I can call on one of you to lead a session, and then when I get back and hear about it, without exception, they're wonderful sessions. Each of us has a perspective. You know, I'm doing this for a long time, but certainly I don't cover everything, and so to have different voices and different people leading and preparing offers us a variety that is very, very important, plural voices. So, Doris, again, thanks for your hard preparation, and people really appreciated it so much. Erev Shavuot, annual Erev Shavuot study session this Thursday night right here, Thursday the 25th at 7:30, and we'll be looking at a variety of ideas about not only what happened at Mount Sinai. As you know, Shavuot celebrates the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, but what is the status of Mount Sinai? I mean, we can't know exactly what happened, though the rabbis do speculate about it in interesting ways, and we'll look at some of that. But exactly what is the status of Mount Sinai, let's say, in comparison with the pre-Sinai natural law idea? There are even commandments before Mount Sinai in chapter 18, Shabbat, and so on. So we'll be looking at the role of Sinai in the understanding of Jewish tradition, Jewish ideas, and a variety of things. So 7:30 will also be live streamed, so I hope one way or another you'll tune in. Thanks in terms of the bagel idea to Jean Dreifert in celebration of her birthday. Happy birthday today. Is it today? Every birthday deserves an applause, doesn't it? Especially as we get, I hate to say it, older. But thank you for sponsoring the bagels and many more wonderful birthdays. Ad Me'ah Esrim, live and thrive till 120, which, as you know, is a magic number, really. 120 is 5 factorial. Did you know that? 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So this is a magic number, as is 72 and 40 and 7 and so on. Doris, thank you for sponsoring live streaming today, and Bob and Sue for picking up. Did it take 2 of you? Very good, very good. One kept the car running. Okay, very good. But I hear myself saying this all the time, but it deserves to be said over and over again. I'm really just so grateful and happy that this bagel process, which is, it's got some complexity to it, picking up and sponsoring and streaming, and it works just so wonderfully. So I appreciate your participation in this. Okay, so blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, in joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so today we begin the 4th of 5 books of Moses, the 4th of the 5 books of the Torah, the book of Numbers. And I want to begin by reading some things from Robert Alter. Some of you have Alter, but I think that he does very, very nicely by way of introducing us to this book. So, if I can find the page. Okay, so Alter says the book of Numbers is in some respects the most miscellaneous of the 5 books of the Torah. But it also includes a series of uniquely fascinating episodes that exhibit distinctive literary features. The first 10 chapters, and there are 36 chapters in the book of Numbers, the first 10 chapters are by scholarly consensus the work of priestly writers, and in a certain sense constitute a continuation of Leviticus. The 4 initial chapters are taken up with a detailed tabulation of the census of the tribes conducted in the wilderness and are the warrant for the prevalent English title of the book, Numbers, a census, numbering, the name of which goes back to the Vulgate, the Latin translation. I think it's Jerome's attempt to improve on the old Latin, if I'm not mistaken. I think that Jerome, once it translates from the Hebrew text itself. So the name Numbers goes back to the Vulgate and to the Septuagint, and is also reflected in a designation appearing in rabbinic sources, Chomesh HaPekudim, which means the 5th, that is, one of 5 books of reckonings. The generally used Hebrew title, Bamidbar, which is simply the first common noun in the text, means in the wilderness. So you can see that both names are appropriate to the contents of the book of Numbers. Numbering, counting, and in the wilderness. The priestly writer's enthusiasm for pageantry. I really like that idea. The priestly, those in charge of the ritual, are interested in pageantry. What is pageantry? Pageantry is spectacle. Spectacle bombards our senses, goes beneath and beyond reason to give us a picture, a dramatic picture, which stands for, represents the spectacle of the thing itself, right? How do we get across meaning? Well, one of the ways is to think it through. The other way is to present a picture. And the picture then becomes memorable. It's something we can feel, explore, dig into. I like this idea of ritual as pageantry, as spectacle. The priestly writer's enthusiasm for pageantry is manifested in this great initial roll call of the tribes, which is picked up in the review of the order of their march through the wilderness in chapter 10. Census for ordering through counting to prepare for the process of marching through the wilderness as a community, an orderly community. Let me start that sentence again. The priestly writer's enthusiasm for pageantry is manifested in this great initial roll call of the tribes, which is picked up in the review of the order of their march through the wilderness in chapter 10, and in the elaborately repetitive rehearsal of the gifts of the 12 chieftains in chapter 7. In between these, we are given laws intended to protect cultic purity, a major interest of the priestly writers, the purity of the cult, of the ritual, because God is put off by impurity. And so if we want to maintain intimacy with God, understood in priestly philosophy version, is to have a pure cult, a pure sacrifice mediated by a pure leadership group, the priests. In between these, we are given laws intended to protect cultic purity in chapters 5 and 6, the suspected wife in chapter 5, and the Nazirite in chapter 6, with considerable attention devoted to the trial by ordeal of the wife suspected of adultery, and to the Nazirite's vow of abstinence, and then the dedication of the Levites and the ritual of the Passover offerings in chapters 8 and 9. Okay? So Alter here has kind of given a summary of the interests of the priestly writers as the people prepare to move forward. Then he goes on in a new paragraph, that was all one paragraph. The book of Numbers returns to the narrative impulse that marks the first half of Exodus. Okay? So if we think about this, chapters 1 through 24 of Exodus are narrative. Then with 25 through the end, 25 to the end, 25 to 40 is all about building the tabernacle in the wilderness. Leviticus is all about the ritual and two forms of purity, the ritual and ethical behavior. And as we'll see in a moment, the timeline, the chronology is not moved on at all in the book of Leviticus. So far from Exodus 25 through the end of Leviticus, we're dealing with priestly materials out of the spatial temporal framework. They happen, I might say, timelessly. So too the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers. So when you think about it, half the book of Exodus, not quite half, a third of the book of Numbers and all of Leviticus are given over to priestly considerations, which has to imply that the priestly schools had something fundamental, pervasive to do with the contents of the Torah. So, Alter again. The book returns to the narrative impulse that marks the first half of Exodus, and indeed with certain pronounced parallels to episodes in Exodus. Although some legal material, in large part concerned with the cult, will be introduced along the way, together with an additional chapter devoted to census, narrative predominates to the end of the book. Okay? So far we have cult and narrative. The Israelites, Sinai behind them, are on the move, edging toward the prospect of the conquest of the land that is first engaged here in the reconnaissance mission of the 12 spies, the famous 12 spies episode, chapters 13 and 14, which Alter is suggesting is a kind of prologue, premonition of what happens starting with the book of Joshua. How far away is chapter 13 and 14 of Numbers to the book of Joshua? And there are two answers to this question. One is quite a bit away. Chapters 13 and 14, the book doesn't end till 36, so that's 20 plus chapters away in Numbers. And then all of Deuteronomy. But if you think of Deuteronomy as having been put into what was at one point, and this is hypothetical, a Tetratuch, 4 books of the Bible, since it's quite clear that Deuteronomy is a kind of interruption, if you assume a Tetratuch originally, then the episode of the spies is fairly close to the book of Joshua, from which I want to make an inference. One of the things the book of Numbers might be about is to lay the foundations for the conquest to come, and to give us intimations of just that process. When you shove the book of Deuteronomy in there between books 4 and 6, it loosens the connection between what happens in Numbers as prologue to its culmination in the book of Joshua. You see that idea? So, the Israelites, Sinai behind them, are on the move, edging toward the prospect of the conquest of the land that is first engaged here in the reconnaissance mission of the 12 spies, and that will become imminent 40 years later in narrative time with actual combat against kingdoms to the east of the Jordan from chapter 21 onward. 21 through 36 also deals with the first forays into battle with the inhabitants on both the east bank and the west bank. We are repeatedly reminded of the passing of generations as the story carries us to the border of the promised land. And we're at the border of the promised land at the end of Numbers, which is another piece of evidence for the late arrival of Deuteronomy into the story. After the incident of the spies, the entire adult generation that came out of Egypt is fated to die before the promise of the land can be realized. Moses, seconded by Aaron, fails the test of trusting in God's provident intervention when he strikes the rock on his own initiative in order to bring forth water. And as a result, he too will not be privileged to enter the land. Okay? Only 2 people that left Egypt get into the land, Joshua and Caleb. Caleb comes from the Hebrew word keleb, which means dog, and dogs are often seen as trustworthy companions. Miriam and Aaron die. Moses' impending death on Mount Nebo is announced by God, and Joshua is lined up to succeed him as leader, the logical narrative continuation of this book being the book of Joshua. Alder now makes that point. But if Israel is on the move from chapter 11 to the end, it must be said that this text associates movement with trouble. After the initial choreographed procession of the teeming tribes, T-E-E-M, the teeming tribes, each arrayed in orderly fashion around its own barrier, what we read about in the first couple of chapters of Numbers. Having said that, let me go back to the beginning of this sentence. After the initial choreographed procession of the teeming tribes, and there is a census, and it turns out that there are 603,000 males over the age of 20 at this moment. After the initial choreographed procession of the teeming tribes, each arrayed in orderly fashion around its own banner, we get repeated representations of a motley crew of malcontents. The Hebrew pejorative, asafsuf, riffraff, is aptly invoked to characterize them. Who are they, by the way? They're Israelites. They're not Moabites or Ammonites. The riffraff, the motley malcontents are Israelites, God's chosen people. A mob churning with complaints and frustrated desires, restive under Moses' leadership, fed up with the hardships of life in the wilderness, and nostalgic for the material comforts of life in Egypt. Wow. This is our people. Okay. So, the various incidents reported in chapter 11 establish a model for much of what follows. The narrative motifs deployed, which first appeared in Exodus and now recur in a whole series of episodes here in Numbers, constitute such a fixed sequence that one is tempted to say they qualify as a type scene, like the type scenes of betrothal and annunciation in Genesis and Exodus. You remember the annunciation scenes to Sarah, to Rebecca, to Rachel, that you shall have a child. Alter also in an early essay talks about the type scene of the woman at the well. Okay? So type scenes are a scene of a basic structure which is reiterated with some variation. Okay? So, the narrative motifs deployed, which first appeared in Exodus and now recur in a whole series of episodes here in Numbers, constitute such a fixed sequence that one is tempted to say they qualify as a type scene, like the type scenes of betrothal and announcement of an imminent birth in Genesis and Exodus. The one notable difference, however, from type scene is that instead of the same scene with significant variations featuring different characters, we have a repetition of the same scene involving the same characters, Israel, Moses, and God, manifesting a certain, so here comes the important word, the type scenes are parallel to one another. What Alter is now pointing out is there's something like a type scene, but not one of them with Rachel and another one of them with Rebecca, but all of them with the same protagonist. So now I'm going to move to this important word. We have a repetition of the same scene involving the same actors, Israel, Moses, and God, manifesting a certain intensification, more than significant variation from one recurrence to the next. So beginning in chapter 11 with all the complaining and all of the anger manifested by God, it moves toward, with greater intensification, to the climactic moment. Moses' apostasy. Okay? So that is the climax here. It even touches the great leader. The scheme of the recurrent scene of murmuring or complaint is as follows. The people bitterly protests its misery in the wilderness, or Moses' leadership, or both. God's wrath flares against the people, expressing itself in some sort of scourge that decimates the Israelite ranks. Moses intercedes, in two instances after God actually threatens to wipe out the entire people and to begin anew with Moses, and he relents. Okay? Murmuring, sin, God is angry, threatens, Moses intercedes. This is prophet as intercessor, pleading to God on behalf of the people, as opposed to pleading with the people as on behalf of God. Moses pleading with the people on behalf of God is the moral, ethical component of prophecy. Moses pleading to God on behalf of the people is the intercessory aspect of prophecy. And then God relents. The two most salient episodes of Israelite recalcitrance are the story of the spies who report the fabulous bounty of the land but despair of conquering it, then seek to storm it without divine authorization, and the story of the mutiny led by Korach, Moses' cousin. Restiveness under Moses' rule is so epidemic that even Miriam and Aaron are infected by it, at one point resentfully rebelling against their brother in chapter 12. Okay? So that is description of what is happening in those intermediary chapters. Now here comes the payoff. This is what Alter infers from it. And he begins by saying, one suspects, so he's leading us to a supposition, one suspects that all these repetitions of the scene of murmuring are introduced because the writers conceived it as a paradigm for the subsequent history of Israel. Recurrent resentment of God's rule and the authority of his legitimate leaders, chronic attraction to objects of base material desire, fearfulness, divisiveness, and the consequences of natural disaster brought about, in the view of the biblical writers, by this whole pattern of constant backsliding. You get the point here? That the authors are either forecasting all of the rebelliousness and desire for mere material objects that happens in the prophetic corpus, the prophetic histories. Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd, Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, right? God sends a prophet, the people backslide, another prophet, people backslide, and finally God is fed up. He sends Assyria, the northern kingdom, into exile, and then he sends the southern kingdom into exile. What Alter is suggesting here is either this is a prediction of what is going to come, or it's a retrodiction. It's written after the events noted in the histories, from the perspective of the exile. So when were these things written? And one could infer one of two possibilities, before or after the events happened. And part of the consensus of scholarship, and I confess I haven't kept up with this issue in terms of the priestly document, the earlier consensus, I think the Wellhausen hypothesis, is that the priestly materials were written in and after the exile. Because after the exile, there was no restoration of the monarchy. There were a few prophets, and it became a theocracy. The people in the Second Temple period under the leadership of priests. So wouldn't you want to now write some stuff about what the priests have to do? Because the priests are now in charge. Namely, these materials were written in the exile. I believe that, I know Jacob Milgram, a great scholar, Rabbi Stanley Schachter of blessed memory, used to say that Jacob Milgram had 12 things to say about each word. And that's why his commentary on Numbers is something like 800 pages. I mean, can you believe it? What'd you read last week? I read Milgram's 800-page commentary of the book of Numbers. Really? That's not me. Anyway, Milgram doubted whether the priestly materials were written in the exile. Okay, so I want to go back to this speculation again and read it again, because I think it's very, very telling. One suspects that all these repetitions of the scene of murmuring are introduced in the book of Numbers because the writers conceived it as a paradigm for the subsequent history of Israel, namely, recurrent resentment of God's rule and of the authority of his legitimate leaders, chronic attraction to objects of base material desire, fearfulness, divisiveness, and the consequences of natural disaster brought about in the view of the biblical writers by this whole pattern of constant backsliding. I think this is really a remarkable summary of what goes on in the book of Numbers and what are its purposes. Let me just go on for a second. For all the prominence of these scenes of rebellion, let's call this X. X stands for the rebellion material. Numbers offers a kind of dialectical counter-image. That would be not X, or the yes and the no. The people are recalcitrant. They're backsliders. Nothing good can come of it. But then Alter is telling us about the other side of the coin. For all the prominence of these scenes of rebellion, Numbers offers a kind of dialectical counter-image to the representation of Israel as an obstinate and refractory mob. This generation that cannot free itself from the slave mentality it brought with it from Egypt also constitutes the beginnings of a people meant to realize a grand historical destiny. How great is that? The book of Numbers as a dialectical text, Hegel before Hegel. You remember Hegel, the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis of the two. So that's what Alter is saying, that not only is this a very intentional, well-crafted, well-structured book for all of its, how did he say it at the beginning? The book of Numbers is in some respects the most miscellaneous of the 5 books of Moses. For all of the miscellany, the sense that this is just a collection of materials uneasily, unconsciously thrown together. No, it's a well-structured text with certain purposes, both priestly and narrative. For all the prominence of these scenes of rebellion, Numbers offers a kind of dialectical counter-image to the representation of Israel as an obstinate and refractory mob. This generation that cannot free itself from the slave mentality it brought with it from Egypt also constitutes the beginnings of a people meant to realize a grand historical destiny. Which raises the question, who are the movers toward of this grand historical destiny? Is it plausible to say the refractory mob? In other words, the refractory mob is represented by X. Who is represented by not X? Not necessarily the people. So I want to suggest to you, just as a hypothesis, that the hero of the book of Numbers is God, who stays with the project in spite of all of the counter forces generated by the people, who would love nothing more than sitting in Fastad, a suburb of Cairo, and having cucumber salads. And all right, if we have to go work and build stuff and storehouses and so on, okay, we have a meal that is promised to us at the end of the morning and at the end of the evening. So I think as a hypothesis, I want to suggest that it's the book of Numbers wants to say something about covenant. If the people are less than willing to do their part of the covenant, God is willing to stay with it. This is the book of Numbers is not the bilateral covenant. I promise to do this if you promise to do that, each with obligation. It's the unilateral covenant, the covenant of promise. You will always be my people. And I'm going to see it through in thick or thin. So I don't know whether you will come to agree with this or not, but I'm always impressed by how God is represented. Even though, God has his nightmares and wakes up in a surly mood in many mornings, but God nevertheless gets over it. And by noon is ready to stay with the course again. God is not giving up. Margie?
It feels like the author of Bamidbar, either women don't exist or they're bad, as in both the episode of Miriam, who is punished for what she says,
With
and
Aaron,
the
with
episode of the unfaithful wife who has to drink
The unfaithful
bitter
wife.
waters. So it feels hostile to women to me, even though you're talking covenant. It seems like they're all celibate men practically in the descriptions.
Celibate?
Well, I mean, there's no sense of women at all until they turn out to be negative.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. We would have to look through numbers pretty carefully to see if there are other episodes in which women are featured, just to get a balanced picture of what you're suggesting. But at least preliminarily, it looks like a very good point. What you're suggesting is this is a steadfastly patriarchal text, among other things, which wouldn't surprise us, would it? I mean, we have over the years, at least I've tried to make the point that there's a strong counter-narrative at work in the Bible that's resisting the adequacy of patriarchy. And we have 15 women who fall under that category. Preeminently, Ruth. If somebody were to ask me who, according to me, is the greatest hero of biblical literature, I would say without hesitation, Ruth. I mean, Abraham, I think of Ruth as Abraham perfected. Abraham is called by God, and he's given promises of reward. He's called and directed, and he's given some felicitous consequences for obedience. Ruth, who also makes a journey, not to the promised land, but to the land of the enemy, she's a Moabite, without being called and without any promise of reward. She acts, I'll be anachronistic here, she is the Bible's first Kantian. Do the right thing for its own sake. It's all about motivation. It's not about consequences. She's not a utilitarian. She's what we call a deontologist, the emphasis on motivation. So women loom extremely large in biblical literature as heroes. Ruth, most of all. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? Shavuot is about the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. There are two ways to receive the Torah. One is you're given something. The other is you get the point of the something and you act in accordance with it. Ruth acts according to Torah principles without ever being given them. So it's just an example of the importance of women, but I don't want to dilute Margie's point. I think Numbers is a patriarchal text, as so many texts are. I mean, who does God speak to basically in the book of Genesis? Men. So it's true. For all the counter-narrative elements, one can't deny patriarchy. Scott?
These are just two questions. The easiest one is, I missed a thing you said earlier. You mentioned two, I guess, sort of characteristics of prophecy, and one was the intercession. What was the first one?
The moral, ethical, legal,
The ethical, okay.
revelational.
So the other question then is, okay, so Alter presents these two possibilities here of either, prophecy or just a historical viewpoint, and makes a case for both. Does he offer a conclusion about them other than here's what they resulted in, or here's what they offer us? Does he conclude one or the other? Or no?
Now, what are the two alternatives again? Before or after? Is that what you're saying?
When it was written, I guess.
Yeah. Not that I know of, but certainly others will do that. Yeah, I just don't know the literature, but I'm sure it's a fascinating one. I mean, the Wellhausen paradigm persisted for 100 years easily. Other comments, questions, Jim?
Well, regarding Ruth and Moses' wife and Abraham and Isaac's wife and all that, the women were not, anything I've read, they were not monotheists. Now, my point to saying that is, I think it's a poke at, we should have some humility here. Yeah, we're the chosen people.
Yes.
But the other people are just as valuable, be they women or men.
What's valuable again?
Everybody.
everybody, not necessarily everybody's theology.
Right. I mean, Ruth is a shining example that you don't have to be part of the chosen people to be a very valuable person.
Yes. The first thing to say is yes. Let's get yes out of the way here.
But I think it's to point some humility at us as
Yeah.
a group.
Right. Well, what's the phrase? Who is it that uses this phrase? The Bible is particularistic in a universalist horizon. I mean, the Bible's stuck. Think of, here we are, we've got a bunch of stories, and these are the stories that find their way into the book of Genesis. And we ask ourselves, where shall we begin? We're writing a history of our people, the history of the Israelites. Where should we begin the story? I have an idea. Let's start with the beginning of the history of our people, Abraham. Let's start with Abraham. In the beginning, God created Abraham. But no, the biblical author or editor has the insight to start before Abraham with universalist history and tells stories of pre-Israelite individuals. That's the universalist horizon. When Amos says, protect the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, he doesn't add a footnote of your Jewish people. Anyway, so universalism threads its way through the text, which is fundamentally, is that the right word? If one were to count chapters, do a quantitative analysis, there'd be much more material on the particularistic history. But, as whoever it was who said it, in an ongoing universalist framework.
But to that point of Ruth, to go further,
She's an exception.
Ruth's not an Israelite, yet she's the reason the line continues.
Oh, no question about it.
So
No.
it emphasizes again the patriarch theme. Even though in today's world, if the mother's Jewish, the child's Jewish, apparently in that world it was the other way around.
Okay, but still, back to Ruth. I mean, Ruth is not an Israelite by birth. He's just an Israelite by conviction.
Right.
Yeah. She chooses, and the choice is not theology so much as companionship.
Yeah.
She's feeling for Naomi, and she wants to be part of Naomi's destiny.
Right.
Yeah. Good. Irv?
I'll take exception. The reason that the Ruth story is remarkable is because she was an exception. She was not, she didn't represent a whole, gender is the term today of her type.
That's a good point. So Irv I'm trying to remember to repeat it for the live streamers. So Irv is suggesting that the reason Ruth is so important, is that how you said it?
Is remarkable.
Is remarkable is she's an exception.
Yeah.
Yeah. And an exception can be understood as to some degree marginal, or it can be seen as an element of polemic, that we're arguing against the prevailing paradigm. She comes from an enemy group. She makes this remarkable thing. According to one interpretation in chapter 1, we'd have to read it. There's a chiastic structure there, A, B, C, B, A, in which really the text says something about, may God do for you what you have done for me. Namely, Ruth and Orpah are the teachers of God. May God follow your lead. So yeah, she is an exception, but the exception takes on elements of the paradigm. So, yeah, no, but we shouldn't lose Irv's point. The overwhelming evidence is oh well, do I want to say it like that? Patriarchal. Margie?
Well, I just wanted to qualify what I said before, because
Yeah.
I realized the daughters of Zelophehad is in this,
Good.
and that's one of the greatest
Yes, it is.
stories about women and gods.
Absolutely. The daughters of, and every time I hear the name in Hebrew, Tzalafchad, the mother of those daughters, at the moment they were born, is having a conversation with her husband, I imagine. What should we name these girls? Let's name them the daughters of Tzalafchad. That's a lot of things to get around in your mouth. Let's name them Shelley and so on. But you know what happens in daughters of Tzalafchad? All the men die in the family. Now the question is, can the daughters inherit the family wealth? And they come to Moses, and Moses doesn't know. No law has been promulgated yet. So Moses says, let's go to God. And when he goes to God, God says, that is a very good question. And so God has to think anew about it. And the new rule is, yes, if there are no descendants, I'm not sure the answer is no descendants, but no descendants, the daughters of Tzalafchad can inherit. And then God goes on to say something remarkable. And let's make this a general law. So we have a law here promulgated or stimulated, not by God, but by 4 women. 4 women lead to a new law by resisting. I agree. I think it's a remarkable moment. So, Margie, thank you for that kind of qualification. But the final verdict would be reading through the book of Numbers with an eye to this issue, just to see how it stacks up. And it's probably overwhelmingly patriarchal with some other elements in there. Yes?
Just getting back to Ruth for a moment. One of the big traditional explanations why we read Ruth on Shavuot is it's the idea of conversion. We all converted at Mount Sinai because we got the Torah and we adopted the commandments, etc. Another angle to that, though, is she joins the Jewish people.
Yes.
So in Judaism, we've got the idea of who is a Jew by belief, a Jew by peoplehood. So
Right.
if you could comment about that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So Ruth is joining them. This is a conversion. Now, there's no conversion ceremony in biblical literature. You become part of the people by joining up with them, right? So Rebekah comes into Isaac's household and now becomes a kind of partisan for the interests of Jacob, of Isaac's people. So the conversion ceremony is rabbinic. But, if one wants to think of conversion as the embrace of the values or the purposes or the reality of a people, then she does convert. And Todd's making another point that it's primarily peoplehood. She does say, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Peoplehood. Your God shall be my God. Now that's theology. And wherever you are buried, I will be buried, and there I will die. Something like that. So she joins both the people and the people's religion. Do you think that's right?
Sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a remarkable moment, isn't it? And it follows by saying, when Naomi saw, because Naomi had said to both Ruth and Orpah, go back home. There's nothing for you in going with me. And they both resist, and she says it again, and then Orpah says, okay, she'll go back home. What I love about that is Orpah is not demonized in order to elevate Ruth. Orpah is a very fine person. She wants to stay with Naomi. But Naomi insists that for her own good, she go back, and she gets it, and she does it. So Orpah is fine, Ruth is remarkable. And when Naomi recognizes that Ruth is determined to go with her, and I believe the verb in Hebrew is mitametzet, which is a reflexive verb. It's action upon oneself. Determination as self-mastery, right? Amatz is be strong. Chazak ve'ematz, be strong and courageous. So the verb here tells us something crucial about Ruth, that she's in control of herself and her values. Her action is on herself by wanting to go to Naomi, with Naomi. So this is about Ruth's character, which expresses itself in caring for another. It's the elevation of me in terms of to the degree to which I use the me to care about others. I think it's a remarkable move. Character is not just for self-celebration. It's for expression in some communal, interpersonal way. Okay, so let's look at the book of Numbers, chapter 1. So, on the first day of the second month, in the second year following the Exodus, okay, so the Exodus is the 15th day of the first month. So this is a year plus 2 weeks later. In the first day of the second month, in the second year following the Exodus. Let's go back, hold this place, and go back to Exodus chapter 40, verse 17. So, 40:17. In the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle was set up. Okay? So the book of Numbers takes place 1 month after the erection of the tabernacle. So almost no time has passed at all. Just a naive reading of the text, which requires going from Exodus 40 through Leviticus, creates the impression that a lot of time has passed. And since it is true that there is no narrative in the book of Leviticus, there are too little narratives, we can see from the timelessness of the book or not timelessness so much as out of time, that it makes sense, although contrary to our impression, that almost no time has passed whatsoever. I want to read another little passage from Alter on this. On the first of the second month in the second year, the tabernacle was completed 1 month earlier. Now, after the priestly legislation that constitutes the book of Leviticus, and which is not tied to a specific date, the narrative turns its attention outward from the sanctuary to the people and to the organization of the census. Okay, so to some degree that's a repetition of what I've just said, or vice versa. This is where I got it. But he does make an additional point here, that the narrative is now turning, even though it's priestly, the focus of the attention is not on the tabernacle itself, the sanctuary, but on the people who are led by or focus on the tabernacle. So let's now begin to read some of Numbers. On the first day of the second month in the second year following the Exodus from the land of Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, saying, okay, take a census of the whole Israelite community by the clans of its ancestral houses, listing the names, every male head by head. You and Aaron shall record them by their groups from the age of 20 years up, all those in Israel who are able to bear arms. Okay, so this gives away what is most important here, and that is the mustering of men to fight battles. It's an anticipation that this is going to represent a struggle and not a smooth journey. Okay? So this is a census for conscription. Associated, verse 4, with you shall be a man from each tribe, each one of the head of his ancestral house. These are the names of the men who shall assist you. Okay? From Reuben, Elitzur, son of Shedeur. From Simeon, from Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, the sons of Joseph, Ephraim, and so on and so on. Down to verse 15. From Naphtali, Achira, the son of Enan. Any observations about this list? Irv?
Why do you say it has a military purpose? Why not merely a societal, organizational purpose?
Well, it says to bear arms.
I missed that. There you go. Okay.
That's the otam, their arms.
But nonetheless, that may not be the purpose. You've got to organize society.
Well, okay. No, that's right.
That's one way of identifying people, but
Okay, that's good. So Irv is making the point that though it may have as one of its purposes conscription, it's got more impact than that. It represents an organization of society, what the community is composed of, and so on. The priestly interest in order, in clarity, mocked by Freud, right? Obsessive compulsive ritual behavior. I think unfairly, I don't know. Maida?
Again, it's about males, about the son of,
Yeah.
not the son of Miriam, the son
no,
of
that's society.
Rachel, the
That's
son
the
of,
society.
it's all male. And one of the texts would say, how do we know it's his son as opposed to her son? So it's interesting because earlier we learned that we didn't always know if it was his son.
Of course. Look, we have to accept that the Bible is fundamentally patriarchal. We just have to accept that. The question is it unaware of the implications of its patriarchal emphasis? Is the Bible also a self-critical text? I say yes. I say in these women who are heroes, who act on behalf of the people. Think about Rachav, chapter 2 of the book of Joshua, who makes the most powerful, eloquent statement of the history of the Israelites, of anybody in the Bible. She knows the story and she protects the spies, okay? So right at the beginning of the book of Joshua, which is very much about destruction and the demonization, I might say, of the Canaanites, here's a Canaanite woman who saves the day for the Israelites. So, yes, it's patriarchal. Of course it is. One can't deny it. But it also is something else in terms of proportion. They're not equal, but they come at significant moments. What else do you notice about this list, Maya?
There is no Levite.
There's no Levite, right? Because the Levites are dedicated to something else, not to military fighting, but to the guarding and the protection of the Mishkan, the sanctuary, the altar. Okay? So there's no Levite. Okay? Anything else? Margie?
The only name I recognize is Nachshon, who was such a leader crossing the first one. So is the assumption that these were all like the best of the possible leaders?
So right, Margie is raising the question of, since Nachshon is from the tribe of Judah, the most important tribe, at least in terms of what comes out of Judah, King David and so on. So Nachshon is a hero from the most important tribe. I wonder, does Nachshon appear in the Bible here, or is it Midrash?
Midrash.
Is it Midrash?
I think so.
He certainly doesn't appear in Exodus 14. He might appear somewhere else as the one. I have to look it up. Okay, so what Margie is suggesting here is that we don't recognize any of the names. Doris? Except
They're not in birth order.
they're not in birth order. Is that true? So Leah's first four come before any of Rachel. Am I right? Well, that's
Is that how they do it?
So it's Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Levi's out, but her children, and then come the children of her concubine, Zilpah, Issachar, and Zebulun. So now we've dealt with Leah, her own and her concubines. Then come Rachel, Joseph, but notice from Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, Manasseh. So these are the grandsons of Jacob. The others here are sons, grandsons, and you remember in that scene where at the end of Jacob's life, Joseph brings him Ephraim and Manasseh. He crosses his hands. He wants the second-born to be the firstborn, the most important. Ephraim becomes extremely important, and then adopts them. They're my sons, and by adoption, they now become tribes themselves, right? So these are grandsons who have been adopted. So we have from Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. We have from Rachel, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then what we have here are four left. We have from Bilhah, Dan, and Naphtali, 1 and 4. Asher and Gad are from, I think I'm wrong here. I think Issachar and Zebulun are Leah's. And I think we now have at the end here two children from each of the two concubines. Dan and Naphtali from Bilhah, Asher and Gad, God in Hebrew, but not God, from Zilpah. So there is an order. And by the way, the last four are a kind of chiastic structure, A, B, B, A. A and the two A's, Dan and Naphtali, are from Bilhah, and Asher and Gad are from Zilpah. So nicely ordered. Jacob Milgram makes an interesting point that none of these names, maybe even not shown in the Bible, but we'd have to check, are ever mentioned again. And there are no what is known as a theophoric element of the name. Yehoshua, Yud-Hey, God's name on the names. Yehoshua was formerly Hosea. With the Yud added, Yehoshua, we now get a divine element in that name. And what Milgram points out is none of these names have theophoric elements, from which he speculates that this is a very, very ancient list. And if it's an ancient list, there are ancient elements that make it into the book of Numbers. So the book of Numbers is created over time by the gathering of elements, something like that. I don't know if this interests you so much. It really fascinates me how these books are put together. Let's go on here. Let's go on. Verse 16. Those are the elected of the assembly, the chieftains of their ancestral tribes. They are the heads of the contingents of Israel. Okay. So Moses, and I guess that's all I wanted to do there. So now we're going to be doing some counting, starting with verse 17. And you see at the end of each paragraph, for example, verse 21, it tells us how many in the tribe of Reuben, right? At the end of 23, how many in the tribe of Shimon, 24 in Gad and Judah, and so on, which arrives at its climax in verse 44. Those are the enrollments recorded by Moses and Aaron and by the chieftains of Israel, who were 12 in number. By the way, the number 12 is a constant. If we don't have Levi, we need to find the number 12. And that will be allowed by if you make Joseph 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay? So 12 is a constant, but who's in that 12 varies a bit. These are the enrollments, verse 44, recorded by Moses and Aaron, by the chiefs of Israel, who were 12 in number, 1 man in each house. All the Israelites aged 20 and over, enrolled by ancestral houses. All those in Israel who were able to bear arms, all who were enrolled came to 603,550. Okay? So, it's a lot of people. Let's continue here. Let's continue on. The Levites, however, were not recorded among them by their ancestral tribe, for the Lord had spoken to Moses, saying, do not on any account enroll the tribe of Levi or take a census among them with the Israelites. You shall put the Levites in charge of the tabernacle of the pact, all its furnishings, and everything that pertains to it. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings, and they shall tend to it. And they shall camp around the tabernacle, okay? So we're now introducing a spatial element. They shall encamp around the tabernacle. And how will the other tribes be arrayed spatially? And the answer is in a kind of square. 3 tribes, 3 tribes, 3 tribes, 3 tribes on each square. They're moving east, I think. And Judah is on the eastern side. So Judah is leading. In the middle of that square is the tabernacle, tended to by the Levites. And as they move through the wilderness, I guess that structure remains intact with the Levites in the middle, guarding what makes this a community, and that is, let me just say, the religion. Okay, so where were we? The Levites, verse 53, the Levites shall, however, shall camp around the tabernacle of the pact, that wrath may not strike the Israelite community. The Levites shall stand guard around the tabernacle of the pact, okay? So this is an interesting element, isn't it? If a person not permitted to approach the tabernacle of the ark happens to do so, so this is the idea of encroachment. You cannot encroach upon something that you're not designated to do. Not only is the community ordered, but the individuals have their own role in the community. And those roles need to be meticulously preserved. And so the Levites are the shomrim, the guards of the tabernacle, in two ways. They preserve it, they maintain it, but they also protect it from encroachment. Just like, and I think the word here in Hebrew is zar, is it? Maybe it comes up later. Remember that Nadav and Abihu brought a strange fire, Eshara, to the altar, and they were zapped. Something foreign, something strange, cannot violate the boundaries set up for the community. The Levites shall stand guard around the tabernacle of the pact. The Israelites, verse 54, did accordingly, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so they did. A very important summary, isn't it? We have here a tripartite hierarchy. God, Moses, the people. Moses directs the people, who himself is directed by God. And if you don't follow that hierarchy, there's going to be trouble. Just as there is for Moses, by in a way violating at Meribah, when God said, speak to the rock, or whatever the crime was. But he violated that order. He did not obey what God had wanted, and that created havoc for him. So, chapter 2, we have how the tribes are arrayed around the tabernacle. In chapter 3, we get to the Levites. Let's look at chapter 3. This is the line of Aaron and Moses at the time that the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. These were the names of Aaron's sons: Nadab, the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. Those are the names of Aaron's sons, the anointed priests who were ordained for the priesthood. But Nadab and Abihu died by the will of the Lord when they offered alien fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they left no sons. Okay? So the author or the editor of this passage knows the story in Leviticus chapter 10 about Nadab and Abihu. So it was Eleazar and Itamar who served as priests in the lifetime of their father Aaron. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, advance the tribe of Levi and place them in attendance upon Aaron the priest to serve him. Okay? So the hierarchy between the priests, the Aaronites, the family of Aaron, and the Levites is maintained here. The Levites serve the priests. The book of Deuteronomy does not know that duality. The Levites and the Levites alone are the priestly officers. Okay? So Deuteronomy, for some reason, I used to know that, abandons the preeminence of the Aaronites. So, verse 5 again. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, advance the tribe of Levi and place them in attendance upon Aaron the priest to serve him. They shall perform duties for him and for the whole community before the tent of meeting, doing the work of the tabernacle. So they're the guards, but they're also the workers. Nobody else can approach the tabernacle, so they have to, do the dusting, have to mop the floors, and so on. They shall perform duties for him, verse 7, and for the whole community before the tent of meeting, doing the work of the tabernacle. They shall take charge of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, a duty on behalf of the Israelites, doing the work of the tabernacle. You shall assign the Levites to Aaron and to his sons. They are formally assigned to him from among the Israelites. You shall make Aaron and his sons responsible for observing their priestly duties, and any outsider who encroaches, the verb here, hazar hakarev. Karev means to approach, but it can also mean to encroach. Approach is legitimate, encroach is an illegitimate approaching. You, verse 10, shall make Aaron and his sons responsible for observing their priestly duties, and any outsider encroaches shall be put to death. Okay? Something big is at stake here, right? The cult and its purity is a necessary condition for the vibrancy, the vitality, the viability of the community. And if it's not maintained meticulously, trouble. And therefore, whoever does violate the structure is committing a capital crime. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I hereby take the Levites from among the Israelites in place of all the firstborn, the first issue of the womb among the Israelites, the Levites shall be mine. For every firstborn is mine. At the time that I smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated every firstborn in Israel, man and beast, to myself, to be mine, the Lord's. So this is a mysterious text, actually. It assumes that the firstborn had the role now assigned to the priests. It doesn't say why they were displaced. I think one speculation is they were among the rebels at the time of the golden calf. I don't believe that's anywhere mentioned. It's not mentioned here. God is still maintaining that the firstborn is mine. The opening of the womb is a miracle. And therefore, what's born is mine. For every firstborn is mine, verse 13. At the time that I smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated every firstborn. So does that mean saved the firstborn of the Israelites? But it is a little mysterious because it suggests in the place of all the firstborn. And why are they displaced? Anybody have anything to say about that? We could look that up, couldn't we? By the way, I know who talks at length about it, Jacob Milgram in his 800-page commentary.
This was discussed last night.
Okay, but now, I mean, whatever the rationale, we now have emphatically that the priests are in charge, chosen by God. What I'd like to do now is move and deal with the Nazirite issue. You remember that Alter says that the Nazirite is one of the ways of illustrating the need for the purity of the cult. So now we have the Nazirite who devotes him or herself. I mean, in a certain way, this may count as a non-patriarchal narrative. I don't know. Chapter 6. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone, man or woman, explicitly utters a Nazirite's vow to set himself apart for the Lord. So this is a kind of a timeout for this person, right? A retreat, I might say, to devote his or her attention to vows. If anyone, man or woman, explicitly utters a Nazirite's vow to set himself apart for the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and any intoxicant. He shall not drink vinegar of wine or any other intoxicant, neither shall he drink anything in which grapes have been steeped, nor eat grapes fresh or dried. Okay, so elaboration on the grape. Throughout his term as Nazirite, he may not eat anything that is obtained from the grapevine, even seeds or skin. Throughout, verse 5, the term of his vow as Nazirite, no razor shall touch his head. It shall remain consecrated until the completion of his term as Nazirite of the Lord, the hair of his head being left to grow untrimmed. So the hair is now somehow sacred. Throughout the term that he is set apart for the Lord, he shall not go in where there is a dead person. Now you may remember that this is also what the priests are obligated to do, to stay away from the corpses. So in this sense, and one doesn't want to overstate it, the Nazirite is functionally the priest. No, has the status of the priest, doesn't function as a priest. Okay, so this is an elevation in sanctity through his own vow. So what are the elements of the Nazirite, the one who is voluntarily chosen to dedicate him or herself? No intoxicant, no wine, or anything pertaining to what makes wine, not cutting his or her hair, and staying away from the dead. Even if his father or mother or his brother or sister should die, he must not defile himself for them. You remember in Leviticus 21, the distinction is made between the priest and the high priest. The priest may be engaged in funerary rites for their parents, but the high priest may not. So the Nazirite not only here attains the status of priest, he attains the status of the high priest. Even if verse 7, his father, mother, brother, or sister should die, he must not defile himself for them. Since hair set apart for his God is upon his head. Throughout his term as Nazirite, he is consecrated to the Lord. If a person dies suddenly near him, defiling his consecrated hair, he shall shave his head on the day he becomes clean. He shall shave it on the seventh day. Okay? The hair becomes contaminated. He shaves it. He undergoes purification rites. And now, on the 8th day, he shall bring 2 turtle doves. Now, so if he becomes contaminated, it looks like it's all over for him. On the 8th day, I may not be right about that. On the 8th day, he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer one as a sin offering, and the other as a burnt offering, and make expiation on his behalf for the guilt he incurred through the corpse. That same day he shall so he can go back. The same day he shall reconsecrate his head and rededicate to the Lord his term as Nazirite, and he shall bring a lamb in the first year as a penalty offering. The previous period shall be void, since his consecrated hair was defiled. This is the ritual for the Nazirite. On the day that his term as Nazirite is completed, he shall be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting. As his offering to the Lord, he shall present 1 male lamb first year without blemish, but for a burnt offering, 1 ewe lamb for the first year, for a sin offering, 1 lamb without blemish, and so on and so on. So, the Nazirite makes a vow. The vow it persists for a period, and then he can return to his daily life. If in the process he becomes contaminated, he needs to bring a bunch of offerings, and the sin offering is for what has happened to his hair. But then when he comes back and this is why I went on with it, when he comes back to be a Nazirite, and this presumption here is not that his hair becomes contaminated, for which he has to bring a sin offering. He nevertheless has to bring a sin offering as he returns to normal life. And here's the question. What's the sin? What do you think? What's the sin? I mean, who knows? But there are a lot of speculations about it. But it's curious, isn't it? Could we speculate as to what the sin might be? Any thoughts about it? Todd?
Well, he had clearly foregone certain opportunities which were eligible for him beforehand. This vow was giving up certain things, giving up wine, which we use to celebrate and other things of that nature. So he was foreclosing himself from engaging in certain activities and getting certain benefits.
So that is one powerful idea here. This is a warning about diminishing in importance the elements of a normally lived life. He makes himself non-normal. He leaves the community. The assumption here behind this as a sin is that communal life in its variety of activities is an inherent good. It's not that we who live normal lives are living at best the penultimate life, and the ultimate life being one of lifelong dedication. If only I could be a priest. If only I could dedicate myself to the altar. No, according to Todd's understanding, don't denigrate in any sense normal life and its celebrations. There's never any interdiction of drinking wine or beer or other alcoholic beverages. So that's one possibility. It's an intriguing one, isn't it? That by indirection, it is an affirmation of the lives that we lead normally, in which we need to be good people and all of this and that and the other thing. Maya?
Maybe it's a warning. Don't take it so lightly. This is a responsibility to withdraw from normal life.
Okay.
So it's like a cautionary thing, you know.
Okay, very good, very good. So Maya's idea is, Todd's idea was to leave normalcy and try to become really holy is a denigration of normal life. That's a speculation. Maya's is, if you're going to climb that ladder, be careful. Do it properly. Don't take it lightly. Okay? Other ideas, Scott?
Well, this is I mean, it's obviously very mysterious. First of all, we don't know the term of this oath. I mean, it's obviously a minimum of 7 days, because there's one aspect where if something happens, you do this for 7 days.
Okay.
We also don't know how far they had to withdraw from society. Do they conduct their normal business, or are they sort of in a welfare state?
Good.
So it's almost Yom Kippur in an exponential sense. Is there any clue?
Wait a minute, before you ask that question, do you draw any inferences from what you've just said about what the sin might be?
For a clue, and that's my next question.
Yes.
In the Hebrew for Nazarite,
Yeah.
is there any root word there that may give a clue to is this a penance for something?
You know, it's very close to the word neder, nezer, neder. So that may have through sound, some indication of making a vow.
But also zar.
Oh, okay, zar. Yeah, zar, for foreign, strange. Although the nun doesn't drop. No, the nun does drop out. Latet, natan, natain, natan. Yeah. So, that's possible as well. Ron?
It seems as though to take the vow to become a Nazarite, there has to be a predilection of zealotry.
Yeah.
They have to be terribly overcommitted to this idea, and yet we're providing them with a vehicle to be tolerated by the rest of the community.
What's the point of, I don't get what you just,
Well,
there's a zealot.
I vow as a Nazarite.
Mhm.
It carries with it some penalty. It is not necessarily a thing free for me, but my penalty is tolerable because I am setting myself aside.
What's the penalty?
For the penalty is giving up booze for one. Not being able to go to a corpse is another.
Oh, okay, I
Because
see.
there's a duty to do that.
There's some deprivation
So
involved.
there's a deprivation there.
And,
I am willing to suffer the deprivation in order to bring myself closer to God.
yes. That's a good thing.
But I'm removing myself from the general community. So I see a Hare Krishna in the airport. Someone very, very zealous.
Yeah, that's your point. It's not just removal, which is Scott's point, Todd's point. Why am I calling you Scott? But you're now making the point, would you accept the word presumptuous? I'm going to now become really holy. Maybe it's also zealotry. That's your point, though, as well. Notice the cogency of some of these. We don't know, but leaving society or the zealotry thing. I'm going to be super pious here. The warning about getting it right. I mean, the text leaves it open, but in a tantalizing way. Ellen?
Well, Samson's mother,
Who?
Samson's mother,
Samson's mother.
when Samson was born, dedicated himself to be a Nazarene.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's not necessarily you who dedicates yourself.
So that's an excellent point. There are two kinds of Nazarite. A Nazarite of destiny and a Nazarite of choice. This is the Nazarite of choice. But there are two examples in the Bible of being destined before you're born to be a Nazarite. Samson and Samuel, I think, is also a Nazarite. So that's a very different kind of Nazariteship, where, your mother says to you, by the way, when you go to kindergarten, I want you to know that no grape juice at nap time. Okay, very good. Margie?
It seems to surround the whole idea of the hair being, my translation says consecrated, but sacred.
Mhm.
We know for Samson, he was devastated.
Yeah.
He was cut. But I have a broader question, which you might have addressed, which is, when did they decide to call this Bamidbar, and the notion of wildness and wilderness, and that everything in here is so obsessively orderly? I don't know if I'm making a false
No.
connection here,
No.
but
You might be.
it's obsessive, really, like what we've read so far.
So you're saying that it's not only a literal term in the wilderness, but it's about wildness in our lives. I think that's creative. It's worth thinking about. Yeah. In terms of the hair, as I understand it, in a lot of pagan cultures, the hair is also sacred. If this is true, then this is a good example of, what's the way to say this? Borrowing from the outside and turning it into something that serves your own purposes. Right. Ahad Ha'am has a wonderful essay, I've referred to it. What's it called? Imitation and assimilation. And there are two kinds of imitation. There's what he calls competitive imitation, where I imitate something in an outside culture, but I'm competitive in the sense that I'm just not acquiescing. I'm going to want to embolden, strengthen who I am. So I go out into the general culture and get a value or an idea and bring it home and domesticate it. So competitive imitation doesn't lead to assimilation. I mean, the parade example for me in the modern world is Zionism. Zionism borrowed a great deal from the outside world, right? The role of the peasant, the rise of nationalism, the use of modern technology, the telegraph, the railroad, the steamship. So Zionism is a good example of borrowing from the outside world, but making it part of our own ethos. Whereas slavish imitation is based upon envy. I envy what you are. I want to be like you, so I become like you and assimilate. So that imitation can take two forms. I think it's one of Ahad Ha'am's great essays. And I think Margie is suggesting here, or at least my inference from that, is that it is a borrowing from pagan cultures. Is it slavish or competitive? Who knows what happened here? But plausibly it's competitive. It becomes part of the ritual of the Israelites, even though it's a borrowing. So borrowing from the outside culture is not necessarily harmful. Russell?
Another thought is that no matter how hard the Nazarite tries, some a baker may have put a seed of a grape in something they ate, you know?
Yeah.
So they're not gonna be perfect, they're gonna strive to be perfect, they won't be perfect.
Yeah.
Or, looking on those three things, they may forget some of the other 613 things they're supposed to do.
That's a good point. That
And
way.
so you can say, I'm gonna screw up anyway, so let me do the sin offering.
So what we're, Enid,
I would ask, what is the motivation for becoming a Nazarene?
yeah,
Is it hubris or humility?
there you go. Right. And why not possibly both? I mean, it's so sparely written. Is it hubris? I want to be, as a sort of Russell's point a little bit, I want to really be perfect here, but I'm going to be caught up in some problem. Or is it, I want to, by subordinating myself to something sacred, I recognize my littleness and I become big through that to which I attach myself. So it's an intriguing issue, isn't it? Phenomenon. And it's hard to know what it's all about. It fits here because this is all about the sacred, the holy, and this is an individual who strives to do it, and then the sin offering is a real puzzle. Todd?
It's an interesting commentary on asceticism, because Judaism has always struggled with asceticism.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say categorically, don't do it at all. Just if you're going to do it, just understand that there's some sinful consequences of it. That's been very influential throughout our history because we've really had very few ascetic movements.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good point. What did somebody once write about the early Christian ascetics? That they stamped infinity on the mind of the West. Asceticism as a kind of striving for purity, for making a pure life the paradigm of life. And in any system, this is how I put it, in which you have God, who reflects the idea of infinity, asceticism is a temptation to imitate God's infinity, to try to get as close to infinity as we can, about which it's an inherent temptation, which is, I think you're right, in the Jewish tradition, put off, right. Gosh, there's more to say about it. I think we have to stop. So, because the camera's going to shut off in 2 minutes, and we can't afford an insight when the camera's off. Isn't that true? So I'll see you next week. Isn't this a kind of a fascinating early book that seems extremely dry to us, but the authors are up to something quite powerful, how to organize a society. Shabbat Shalom. Yeah. Glad to have you back.
Nice to be back. Exercise my mind again. I don't want to take the feminists on. 2,500 years ago, there was a patriarchal society. 2,000 years ago, we had a patriarchal society. 1,500 years ago, we had a patriarchal society. 1,000 years ago, we had a patriarchal. 500 years ago, we had 200 years ago. All of a sudden, it's aberrant. I mean, I understand where they're coming from.
Well, look, I mean, the point that you're pointing to is what are the felicities, the functions of a patriarchal society?
No, that's not what I'm trying to say.
Really? Because
what I'm trying to say is that it appears that human nature, left to its own devices, organizes itself into patriarchal society.
Well, that is part of its function. That's an argument for its function. It's rooted
for its evolution.
In nature.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, that's a strong argument because if that's true, then non-patriarchal societies are unnatural.
Well, no, we try to improve upon that. I'm giving a talk in a week about the history of immigration to the United States, and one of the powerful forces impacting our immigration laws has been xenophobia. The history of the United States has been attempting to overcome xenophobia, a prodigious project that is undertaken with some degree of success. So you can improve upon what exists, but it's not always easy.
But if xenophobia is rooted in human nature, you can't overcome it.
Well, you can't entirely overcome it. All right, if I don't forget, I'll send you 8 paragraphs.
Okay, good. Now, you see the point that I'm making, though? That's the question about patriarchy. Is it a cultural artifact,
No.
or is it written on the face of nature?
I believe the latter, and it's not such a terrible thing to try to overcome it for other reasons.
What if I tried to overcome the laws of gravity?
You can't, that's a little different.
That
Human
isn't-
behavior is not as fixed as the laws of nature.
Well, I don't know. If there is such a thing as human nature and social constructs at their best reflected, and you toy with it at your peril.
No. Well, yes, you could say that. On the other hand, you think about it, you say, well, maybe this is worthwhile toying with. There are reasons to ameliorate it.
Well, and therefore,
I mean, it's human nature to try to murder somebody who instilled road rage. It's a good thing to try to overcome it if we can.
well, I wouldn't say that's an example of human nature.
It is.
Say that's
Kill that bastard.
human temptation, not human nature.
Well, okay. You know, I encountered a quote years ago, which was attributed to Svetlana Alalilova, Stalin's daughter. And I haven't been able to document where it came from. It goes something like this: it's not kings or presidents or parliaments who rule the world. It's human nature. Okay.
You know John Wooden, the favorite coach of the...
Yes,
And he was asked at the end of his career, what was your most important, your strongest opponent throughout your career?
Yeah.
He didn't say Clemson, he didn't say Maryland, he said human nature.
His quotes are fantastic. They were
Oh,
great.
they really are.
Yeah. Okay.
I have everything, it's
I gotta
all.
get out of the paper.
I got it already. Wait, or what do you want? Where are you going?
I'm gonna get it out.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Just don't turn there.
Yeah.
You're reminded
But that's what I'm just saying.
all the time. People on this side, people on this side. This is sort of the angle of my vision, and I've got to try not to.
I only raise my hand like once a month.
Hold on to your question, and what you mean.
No, I was responding, and whatever Russell said is exactly what I was going to say, so that was the end of it. But no, I'm just saying,
You're reminding me. But next week, if you're here, remind me at the beginning. Because the half-life of our memory.
mine's even less than that.
So, my question is, it's been nice to do it.
You know, oftentimes,
Then you went on to point out that this was the great fruit. You read about these would be all men. I come
I don't know what that is.
What is conflict
But what we do,
is that there's a powerful counter narrative. Right. Threads its way through the Bible. I take it as a kind of subtle, silent polemic against the adequacy of patriarchy. I mean, when Judah goes down and marries, Tamar, marries Judah, is really about to destroy his he recognizes, he says in the end, she's much more righteous than I am. This Canaan who controls this word attention. So, Judah is not a nobody.
but,
So the question is how big conclusion get with the rabbi.
They're good. And she says that everything is about men. Right. And it's very strange that this part of the temple.
oh, right. And the fact that they came back, it's been brought off. Yeah, that was one.
I think it's getting speculation about the existence of matriarchs.
Sounds like they do.
You're saying that the clock is You're doing okay? Your shoulder? Pretty safe. When you're ready, at whatever pace, we'll come through with maybe months. Yeah, maybe months, okay, but I don't know if I can wait any longer.
Hi. So you asked about the first Levites sort of assuming firstbornship, and you asked. I would say that that's explained by the fact that the priests wrote the book. But more specific,
So I go along with the hypothesis that these were written during the exile. People were very vulnerable. I mean, I don't know if it's Mary Douglas, they came back and they wanted to know, just tell us what to do so that we don't screw this up again. And so they turned to the priests and they came up with Leviticus and said, this is how you got to do it. Which, I think people get confused a little bit between where Leviticus is placed in order, close to the golden calf. Doris made a big point about this is sort of the antidote to, and historically, it wasn't the golden calf, but you were 80 years in exile, which is like another golden calf, but with a punishment. And how do we not, what do we need to do? Tell us what we need to do. So they were vulnerable, they wanted to know, and Leviticus is the priest's answer to what you got to do.
So, would you say the difference between the priestly ethos and the prophetic ethos is, for the priests, there's a premium on stability, on stasis. For the prophets, society is always in need of what we have to deliver.
But is it because, am I right that we don't know a lot about First Temple practice of Judaism? So, most of the prophets were before the exile, when there might not have been, there were, as I recall, there were altars set up all over Israel, so, apparently their marching orders from God was not to create Leviticus, not to, centralize everything and give it a ritual. Seems to me they were more moral and ethical, did they talk about, the prophets, did they talk about how to practice Judaism? What I remember was whoever was said, do you think I'm interested in your fast and that kind of thing? But that was more of an ethical and a moral, I'm more interested that you live.
And that's post-exilic, too, right at the end of Isaiah.
Okay.
And Jeremiah is very critical of those who go to the worship service and then do bad things. They think that that's going to save them. Yeah, there's an interesting question as to whether the prophets are anti-ritual or just not. They're not opposed to the ritual per se, it's just, it's pervasive.
Right, but could it be because what was the ritual then, in the first temple period, apparently wasn't